Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're checking out the first 1440p 480Hz OLED gaming monitor to hit the market. It's the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG27AQDP. This beast was announced quite a while ago and is finally arriving this month, succeeding the popular PG27AQDM with a new WOLED panel and double the maximum refresh rate. With this combination of OLED speed and refresh rate, the motion clarity on offer could be perfect for competitive gamers, while still offering HDR with per pixel control for single-player titles. The PG27AQDP is still fundamentally a similar design to the 1440p OLEDs we've seen before. It packs a 27-inch panel with rated 0.03 millisecond response times, adaptive sync, display HDR 400 True Black, all the usual stuff. But the LG WOLED panel is from a newer generation, bringing not just the new 480Hz refresh, but higher brightness in line with other 2024 models and a new subpixel structure. This should allow it to better compete with the latest 1440p 360Hz QD-OLED panels that were introduced this year. At $1,000 US, this is definitely a premium product, though it's debuting at the same launch price as the PG27AQDM, its 240Hz predecessor. The 240Hz model is now available for below $800 US, as are other similar WOLEDs, so relative to the current market, it's in a premium position, leveraging that 480Hz refresh to set a high price. We'll see whether it's worth that premium as we go through the results. The design is very similar to previous Asus OLEDs, featuring an elevated three-legged metal stand, a front that's dominated by the WOLED panel with an illuminated ROG logo below, and a central box design on the rear. This continues to allow the thinness of the OLED panel to shine, and while it's overall on the more gamery end of the scale, I think it looks pretty good. It also features plenty of RGB LED lighting, such as the Matrix logo on the back and the silly projected logo out of the base of the stand. The one update Asus has made is switching out the opaque grey plastic on the rear for a translucent grey plastic, which sort of allows you to look at some of the components within. Unfortunately, monitor components in this area of the display aren't that exciting, so you're not seeing heaps of interesting circuit boards, but I guess it looks cool and is a bit unique. Asus have retained their fanless design from the previous model, so there's no annoying fan noise here. There's better connectivity on the new model. We're getting one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC and two HDMI 2.1 48 gigabits per second ports with DSC. So now all ports on this monitor support the full 480Hz refresh rate. Previous Asus 1440p OLEDs use HDMI 2.0, limiting those ports to just 144Hz, so it's a big upgrade. Unfortunately, 1440p 480Hz exceeds the bandwidth requirements of even HDMI 2.1, so DSC is required. There's also a 2-port USB 3.1 hub, but no KVM or USB-C. The PG27AQDP OSD feature set includes a lot of what we've seen from Asus before, including multiple color modes, unlocked color space emulation, several OLED care features, and plenty of gaming stuff like crosshairs, shadow boosting, and a sniper mode. Asus have also taken the opportunity to add in some pretty dubious AI assistant features to capitalize on the AI hype train, the same features seen on the PG32 UCDP. For example, the AI crosshair is just a normal crosshair, usually blue or green, but this time it changes color depending on the background. So if the background is dark, the crosshair turns white. If the background is orange, the crosshair turns pink. It's a potentially useful feature, but let's be honest, implementing it does not require any AI model whatsoever, so calling that an AI crosshair is pretty dumb. One of the more significant improvements in the new 480Hz WOLED panel, aside from the refresh rate, is the updated subpixel layout. This panel moves to RGWB for the first time, the same layout used in the latest 32-inch 4K panels, ditching the older RWBG design. This helps with text rendering, as the main subpixels are now in a more standard RGB arrangement from left to right, instead of RBG, which is worse for text fringing when applications use subpixel rendering designed for RGB displays. There's still a fourth white subpixel though, in keeping with other WOLED panels. It's also naturally a less dense design than the 4K panels, as 1440p at 27 inches is only about 110 ppi. This change in subpixel structure improves the text quality on the PG27AQDP compared to previous 1440p W OLEDs. It's not a perfect solution, but text is clearer and closer in appearance to an LCD in most circumstances with less horizontal shadowing. There is still some shadowing and artifacts related to the inclusion of the white subpixel, so this panel isn't quite at the level of an LCD. However, I'd say it's reasonably good for a bit of web browsing or document editing. This makes WOLED at this resolution more competitive with QD-OLED, and in my opinion raises WOLED up to parity with Samsung's triangle subpixel layout. The artifacts you see are different, comparing RGBB WOLED with QD-OLED. The latter has pink-green fringing above and below text, but it's a much of a muchness as to which offers the better experience. I don't have strong thoughts here, neither is quite as crisp as an IPS LCD, but it's a non-issue for gaming and it's usable for desktop tasks. Much to the disappointment of some people, the AQDP uses essentially the same matte coating as most other WOLED monitors, though this does provide a point of difference compared to glossy QD-OLED. Unfortunately, for those that prefer glossy, we're not seeing a glossy WOLED panel like we got with the XG27AQDMG. The main advantage to the matte coating and WOLED screen composition is how it handles brighter environments. WOLED preserves deeper OLED blacks in brighter rooms as the panel reflects less ambient light. The matte screen coating also prevents mirror reflections, instead diffusing light, making it harder for reflections to distract you. The disadvantage is coating grain, which is mild to moderate here, but still reduces the apparent sharpness of the panel. In some environments, the way the matte coating diffuses light will also result in a worse apparent contrast ratio. In a light-optimized setup, glossy QD-OLED typically looks clearer with more pop to the image. Whether matte or glossy is better for you is highly subjective and depends heavily on how you will use your monitor and the environment it will be in. This is the beauty of there being multiple monitor options. If you feel strongly about glossy, just get one of the glossy monitors, but if you desire a matte finish for its bright room advantages, this WOLED is available and it works well. Like all other OLEDs, there is a risk of permanent burn-in when using this display for prolonged periods with static content, like many desktop or productivity apps. This makes it difficult to recommend for people that primarily use their monitor for work with only the occasional amount of gaming or content consumption, but for those that mostly use their monitor for entertainment, this should be a non-issue. Asus are continuing to offer a 3-year burn-in warranty, which is the standard across most OLEDs in 2024. Response time performance is excellent on this 480Hz WOLED monitor, as it is for other OLED displays that we've tested so far. OLED offers lightning fast response times around the 0.3 millisecond mark at its maximum 480Hz refresh rate, and that leads to fantastic motion clarity. OLEDs also maintain the same performance at all refresh rates, so even when testing at 240, 120 or 60 Hz, we see similar results in the 0.3 millisecond range. This is a nice benefit for variable refresh rate gamers that results in a single overdrive mode experience. In contrast, many LCDs typically perform worse at lower refresh rates relative to their maximum refresh. The major limiting factor to OLED motion performance right now is the refresh rate itself, but this isn't as much of an issue when you're offering a class-leading 480Hz refresh rate as standard. As a sample and hold monitor, OLEDs can still have some blur in fast motion scenes, and the level of blur depends on the refresh rate. At 480Hz, clarity is breathtaking, but when running the display closer to say 60Hz, clarity is reduced simply because the refresh rate is reduced, even though response time performance is basically identical at 480 and 60Hz. Still, having such fast response times gives OLED a noticeable advantage over a slower response time LCD running at the same refresh rate. There is effectively no difference in response time performance between this WOLED and other OLED monitors, including QD-OLED variants. This means motion clarity is identical when the refresh rate is the same. However, OLEDs are much faster than even the fastest LCDs I've tested, and this is true whether we look at the best performance or average performance across the refresh rate range. Not only are OLEDs fast, they also have no overshoot artifacts, which can be an issue with some LCD models. When viewing cumulative deviation results, we can see that OLED gets much closer to ideal response time behavior, and in most cases offer performance an order of magnitude better in this metric than LCDs. In practice, this leads to around a 1.5 times advantage in clarity at a given refresh rate. So 480Hz OLEDs like the AQDP offer a similar experience to 720Hz LCDs, which last I checked don't exist, but theoretically that's what one would look like. In regular usage conditions, especially with features like Adaptive Sync and HDR enabled, this is the fastest, smoothest, and clearest monitor that you can get. Looking at motion clarity in the Blurbuster's UFO test shows excellent results once again for a 480Hz OLED, very similar to what we saw with the 1080p 480Hz mode on recent dual mode 4KW OLEDs, except at a higher resolution now. Text in motion, for example, is the most readable it's ever been, even in comparison to the 540Hz TN LCD PG27AQDP. In these standard usage modes with Adaptive Sync enabled, you just won't find a clearer monitor than a 480Hz OLED right now, with a slight edge over previous 360Hz QD-OLED models. If you don't want to stuff around with backlight strobing or find those features annoying, there's no better choice for competitive gaming, and you get the benefit of retaining versatility thanks to proper HDR support. The only legitimate challenger to a 480Hz OLED in motion at the moment would be a 540Hz LCD with backlight strobing enabled, such as the PG27AQDP. It's actually a lot closer than I thought it would be, but in edge case scenarios, especially super fast motion, a strobed LCD does deliver superior clarity. With that said, backlight strobing on something like the PG27AQDP is highly restrictive. You have to sacrifice variable refresh rates in HDR, you have to run your game at a locked frame rate that matches the refresh rate for it to work properly, and typically we only see this performance from TN LCDs which have other issues like viewing angles. The PG27AQDP gives you great motion clarity in a much broader range of conditions, making it a big winner. Like other recent Asus OLEDs, this new 480Hz model supports ELMB black frame insertion. This feature works to boost the clarity of gaming by displaying every second frame as a black frame. It achieves this through technically running at 240Hz for a 120Hz signal input or 480Hz for a 240Hz signal input. Only fixed 120 and 240Hz is supported, and you also have to sacrifice VRR, HDR, and some brightness. Disappointingly, there's no option to take a 120Hz signal up to 480Hz by inserting 3 black frames between every image frame. At 240Hz, using ELMB does look clearer than not using ELMB, but the implementation is far from perfect. As this is simply showing a black frame every second frame, the non-black image frames have a long strobe length, the length of each refresh cycle, which does lead to some blur relative to a well-strobed LCD that typically would produce a much shorter, sharper pulse. A short image pulse with a long black cycle produces the best image clarity, but this OLED really isn't capable of doing this. All it's doing is running its normal refresh cycle and switching between an image frame and a black frame. The end result is that the ELMB mode at 240Hz looks similar to 480Hz without BFI, and it's the same for 120Hz with BFI versus 240Hz without. It's a nice bonus feature, but I personally wouldn't use it given you have to disable other features, and it's not able to deliver the crystal clear output of the best backlight strobed LCDs. The second feature is OLED anti-flicker, designed to combat variable refresh rate flicker in rare scenarios. Like we saw in the Asus XG27AQDMG, all this feature does is reduce the variable refresh range. With the setting off, the monitor uses a 40 to 480Hz range with low frame rate compensation, giving us an effective VRR range of 0 to 480Hz. With anti-flicker on middle, the variable refresh range shrinks to 160 to 480Hz, and on high it shrinks further to just 200 to 480Hz. The good news here is that this is a less aggressive nerf than we saw with the initial XG27AQDMG implementation. Both modes retain LFC support, resulting in an effective 0 to 480Hz range, just with LFC activating more often. Across extensive OLED gaming, I haven't encountered many instances of flickering during actual gameplay, but there's the occasional menu or loading screen where it occurs. In one of these examples in Cyberpunk 2077, enabling anti-flicker on middle or high reduced but didn't fully eliminate flickering. I think that's a win and will potentially help alleviate some of the worst instances of flickering in situations with extreme frame rate fluctuations. Input lag is elite on the PG27AQDP, as you would hope, with a processing lag of 0.1 milliseconds and total input lag, including response times, below 1.5 milliseconds. With such a high refresh rate contributing very little refresh lag, this is basically as fast as modern monitors get, and it allows for near instantaneous input. It feels incredibly fast to use and extremely responsive, which is excellent news for fast-paced competitive gaming. This level of input lag is also seen in the HDR mode. Power consumption is pretty much identical between the PG27AQDP and other 27-inch 1440p OLEDs. The increase to 480Hz seems to have made a very small impact to power usage, but nothing significant. These panels benefit from having a white subpixel, reducing power consumption when viewing full white compared to QD-OLEDs. However, in scenes where the white subpixel isn't used as heavily, WOLED and QD-OLED power consumption changes quite a bit, to the point where QD-OLED is superior at times. In either case, you're looking at increased power consumption relative to LCDs of the same spec. This monitor has identical color space coverage to other WOLEDs with 97% coverage of DCI-P3 and around 72% coverage of Rec 2020. That's okay for wide gamut use and HDR gaming, but falls short of competing QD-OLED monitors that sit more in the 80% range. Factory SDR calibration is pretty strong, especially for grayscale, where the monitor produces a low delta E average, very good adherence to sRGB gamma, and a decent color temperature with little observable tint. However, we don't get an sRGB gamut clamp enabled by default, so SDR content is oversaturated, a common issue with wide gamut monitors. Relative to other gaming monitors, the PG27AQDP produced excellent factory grayscale numbers that are ahead of most other options, including QD-OLEDs and previous Asus models like the PG27AQDM. Color checker performance is more in the average range, but not awful comparatively speaking. Asus also provide a lot of flexibility with their color modes, including the ability to enable an sRGB gamut clamp without locking out other features. This is in addition to a dedicated sRGB cal mode, though I found just switching the display color space into sRGB produced great results. In this configuration, grayscale performance is a little worse than the default experience, but still pretty good, while gamut clamping is effective at emulating sRGB and reducing oversaturation. This is the most accurate way to view SDR content on this display. This display performs well relative to others in their sRGB modes, producing a grayscale delta E average below 5.0, which is great, and among the better group of displays I've tested. Color checker also holds up well, and really anything within a few delta E's of this monitor is going to look pretty similar, with anything under 5.0 a solid result. Being in the upper third of results is great and confirms that Asus have done some nice factory calibration work. With a wide range of color controls, decent color space emulation, and strong factory accuracy, there isn't a whole lot of reason to perform a full color calibration. I did so anyway using CalMan, and the results were good, but not a game changer compared to what you can do in the hardware. If anything, that's a good thing. I want to see as much done in hardware as possible so buyers don't have to rely on ICC profiles. Max HDR Brightness is very similar to other OLED monitors from the last few years. These newer generation WOLED panels are supposed to be brighter than their predecessors, and that can be true. For example, the PG27AQDP is 34% brighter than the 27GR95QE, and 9% brighter than the PG27AQDM, but the gap isn't that large to other options. Pretty much every OLED these days is between 240 and 270 nits, including 360Hz QD-OLED competitors. LCDs are still the far brighter monitors, though the 265 nits the AQDP delivers is still fine for most use cases. Also, Asus offer a uniform brightness setting, which is not enabled by default, and caps the monitor to around this 265 nit level for all window sizes, rather than varying brightness as you resize windows, behavior that I find annoying. Minimum brightness is great at 31 nits. Viewing angles from this display are great. I didn't really have any issues with previous WOLED viewing angles, but this new generation of panels is supposed to be wider there, and the results are very decent. Uniformity was also pretty good, and there appears to be less dirty screen effect than I experienced on the first generation of 1440p WOLEDs, though it can still be visible in some scenarios. QD-OLEDs still have less dirty screen effect if that matters to you. The Asus PG27AQDP is well suited to HDR from a hardware perspective. OLED panels, including WOLED, directly emit light and have individual pixel control, which makes them ideal for displaying HDR content. This feature allows each pixel to independently vary from fully switching off to displaying bright highlights, giving us deep, zero-level blacks and per-pixel local dimming. The level of control OLEDs provide minimizes blooming in high contrast scenarios and allows for clean distinction between bright and dark areas that are close together. Compared to LCDs with a multi-zone backlight, OLEDs have far fewer ugly illumination artifacts, which are most noticeable when displaying difficult scenarios like star fields or subtitles, and there are no zone transitions as bright objects move around the display. With per-pixel control as its main advantage, OLEDs are best at displaying high-contrast scenes with rich shadow detail, which is a key aspect to a good HDR presentation. Darker content interspersed with dazzling bright highlights brings out the best in OLED displays, as does HDR content with fast motion. For gamers especially, input latency on most OLEDs is low in the HDR mode. The weakness to the HDR presentation on an OLED is overall brightness. While peak brightness can be high in the best cases, full screen brightness is low, and this limits the punch in bright daytime scenes. LCDs may not have per pixel control, but zoned backlights can simply get significantly brighter in bright scenes. Depending on what you want out of an HDR monitor, your preference could swing more towards LCDs or more towards OLEDs, but typically speaking, OLEDs are a great choice that deliver a fantastic HDR presentation. This monitor comes with several HDR configurations, although the differences in performance are not very substantial. The main mode with the best accuracy is the Gaming HDR mode, which caps brightness to around 750 nits. This can be extended up to over 1000 nits for small elements by enabling the brightness adjustable setting and increasing brightness from 90 to 100 at a small cost to accuracy. The default experience, Gaming HDR with brightness adjustable disabled, has okay EOTF tracking and HDR accuracy. There's a few sections where brightness is either a bit too high or a bit too low, so there's room for improvement there, but it's not at the level of hugely hurting the experience. Unlike QD OLEDs, we don't see panel dimming in brighter scenes, though at larger window sizes like 50% we see roll-off occur a bit earlier. Color accuracy is also okay, again not outstanding and some room for improvement, but it's fine enough. When turning the adjustable brightness setting on and setting brightness to 100, we see 2% window brightness increase from 750 nits to a little over 1100 nits. However, for small window sizes, the upper part of the EOTF range has elevated brightness, which makes these scenarios less accurate than the dimmer default Gaming HDR configuration. Other window sizes, like 10%, are less affected, but still somewhat less accurate than the default configuration, so there is an accuracy trade-off if you want to enable the full brightness range. In the following charts, I've used the Gaming HDR mode with brightness adjustable on and set to 100. For full screen white brightness, there's little to no difference between most OLED monitors. At 10%, we're getting about 770 nits, which is in line with other 2024W OLEDs and significantly brighter than QD OLED competitors that usually top out at just 470 nits. However, brightness is actually slightly lower from this new model than the original PG27AQDM in this test. 2% brightness reaches 1141 nits, and I did see other window sizes reach nearly 1300 nits, validating Asus's marketing claims. This is a 27% higher result than the PG27AQDM, which is good to see, although it's not that much brighter than most QD OLEDs. Here's how these results compare to a selection of other OLEDs. Performance is basically identical to the XG27AQDMG, offering higher peak brightness and better large window brightness than the original PG27AQDM at the expense of lower brightness around the 10% range. Compared to QD OLED, these newer WOLED panels are brighter for white brightness, especially around a 10% window size. In real scene brightness, the PG27AQDP performs well, again offering very similar results to the XG27AQDMG, which was one of the brightest OLEDs in real content. The mid-APL results on the right show that AQDP does not dim the panel in brighter scenes, unlike QD OLEDs. In fact, if anything, the panel is brighter than it should be, impacted by the EOTF tracking we saw earlier. I can also confirm that in general, the new AQDP model is brighter than the PG27AQDM, especially in higher APL scenes. On average across our 8 samples, it was 15% brighter, so we're not talking huge numbers, but certainly an uplift comparing what I would class as the first and second generation of 1440p OLED panels. Relative to QD OLED monitors, generally the PG27AQDP is brighter and again doesn't suffer from panel dimming in its brightest configuration. For peak highlight brightness, QD OLEDs like the MSI 271QRX and Gigabyte FO27Q3 can be brighter, but WOLED holds the lead in most mid and higher APL content. Relative to the MSI 1440p model, this new Asus 480Hz option is 13% brighter on average. Again, not a huge margin, but it is better. Obviously, the class leaders in real-world brightness are still LCDs with local dimming. Accuracy is probably where the AQDP doesn't hold up quite as well. In its brightest configuration, this monitor is only mid-table for grayscale performance and a step behind the best models. Using the default Gaming HDR mode is only a couple of delta E's better, so it doesn't change its standing much. Color match performance is reasonable even in its brightest mode. Then when it comes to color volume, QD-OLEDs have both a wider color gamut and are capable of much higher color brightness, increasing overall color volume substantially. In our new ICT-CP test measuring MDC, the MSI271QRX ended up producing a 44% higher result than the PG27AQDP. Final section is the essentials checklist. Asus do a good job of advertising this monitor, although they probably should be a bit clearer about HDR brightness capabilities, and of course there's the usual response time shenanigans. In the feature support matrix, we see very strong results in the contrast and motion sections, which is reflective of the strengths of OLED technology. There's even some BFI support, along with other strengths such as an unlocked sRGB mode, user upgradable firmware, max refresh rate support across all inputs, and passive cooling. However, the display lacks more advanced USB functionality, eOTF tracking isn't as strong on AMD GPUs due to the usual FreeSync Premium Pro issues, and fixed 60Hz input lag was a bit high. The Asus ROG Swift PG27AQDP is the ultimate OLED monitor for competitive gamers. There's simply no beating the motion clarity a 480Hz OLED offers in its standard configuration, and it does so while retaining support for adaptive sync and HDR. If you are running fast multiplayer titles in the 400 plus FPS range, this display looks phenomenal, and it complements this with very low input lag for extreme responsiveness. It's a joy to play on, and you just won't see motion clarity this good without moving to a top-tier strobed LCD. And to be honest, for a lot of people, choosing an OLED over a strobed LCD could make more sense. When you get to those best of the best LCDs, we're usually talking about 540Hz TNs, which just don't come close to an OLED in terms of image quality. There's no HDR support at all, terrible viewing angles, and all the restrictions of backlight strobing to worry about, like it generally not being compatible with variable refresh rates. This 480Hz OLED is more versatile and still offers really great clarity, so unless you're a purist, I find it pretty hard to justify those strobed 540Hz LCDs over this sort of monitor. In addition to being an excellent product for competitive gamers, the PG27AQDP is a highly flexible monitor, producing top-tier results across all types of games. If you do a mixture of multiplayer and single-player gaming, this OLED is perfect due to its decent 1440p resolution, stunning HDR performance including per pixel control, and outstanding contrast ratio. It's even one of the brightest OLEDs I've tested in HDR scenes, slightly outperforming other models and not having any of the panel dimming concerns of QD-OLED. I was pleased to see a couple of small advancements introduced here as well relative to earlier 1440p WOLED releases. The new RGWB subpixel layout improves text clarity, putting it on par with QD-OLED alternatives. The anti-flicker feature seems to work reasonably well and benefits from the higher panel refresh rate that's on offer, and generally brightness is a bit higher, though this depends on the exact comparison. Asus continue to offer great color calibration and hardware color controls, including an unlocked sRGB mode, although this model could do with some HDR eOTF tweaks, especially in its brightest configuration. OLED manufacturers are still struggling to offer the best brightness and best accuracy simultaneously, which is a little unfortunate, although this model gets much closer to that golden zone than its QD-OLED competition. The main weaknesses I see are the price and its matte screen coating. I don't hate the matte finish, but it's divisive and some buyers do prefer glossy. I felt like the glossy coating on the XG27AQDMG offered a great mix of clarity and black level preservation, so I would have liked to see a second PG27AQDP variant with a glossy finish, so buyers could choose between matte and glossy in an otherwise identical product. We're stuck with matte for now, and the usual trade-offs between this and QD-OLED monitors. At $1,000 US, this is an expensive monitor, especially at just 27 inches and a 1440p resolution, so it's not going to be for everyone. Relative to previous 240Hz WOLEDs and also 360Hz QD-OLEDs, I don't feel there's enough extra here for an everyday buyer to justify paying $1,000. If you don't typically play games above 240 FPS, for example, if you're more of a single player fan, the $700 XG27AQDMG offers better value and gives you pretty much everything this display has, including its second generation brightness boost and all the OLED goodness. You're only really missing out on the 480Hz refresh rate and better subpixel structure. Yes, the PG27AQDP is typically the better monitor, but it's not 43% better, which is the difference in price. 1440p 360Hz QD-OLED models like the MSI 271QRX and Gigabyte FO27Q3 are also currently available for $800 US, so $200 less than this new 480Hz W OLED. Those two are better value products and get you most of the way to what the PG27AQDP offers. Yes, motion clarity and input lag at 360Hz isn't quite as good as at 480Hz, but it's pretty close and definitely a top-tier experience. This leaves the PG27AQDP as a bit of a niche product for buyers that must have the best of the best when it comes to motion clarity and OLED performance. I don't think $1,000 is outrageous when it's positioned as the best and generally delivers on that, but it's definitely expensive and hard to recommend to a wide gaming audience. A price tag around $800 would probably change my mind on that, and who knows, it could be a really great buy in your region. So anyway, that's it for this look at the first 1440p 480Hz gaming monitor. I know a few of you, especially some of our Discord members, were waiting for this one to see which of the 1440p models you should go for. As I said, generally I think the existing models are better value, but if you desperately want the 480Hz functionality, well, there's a new monitor available for you. And this is the fastest 1440p monitor in terms of refresh rate on the market. In fact, in terms of response times as well, now that I come to think of it. So yeah, interesting product there. If you do want to support our testing that we do here at Monitors Unboxed and Hardware Unboxed, we have our Patreon and Floatplane accounts. Links to those are in the description below. If you sign up, you'll get access to some cool benefits like our Discord chat, which is a great place to talk about monitors, get recommendations, those sorts of things. We've got ICC profiles available. We've also got BTS content, monthly live streams, lots of good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.